Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be taking a look at a topic that's pretty pervasive and pretty problematic: sexual objectification. We're going to be looking at an article called The Objectification of Others, a psychological and societal exploration. And hopefully, through our discussion today, we'll walk away with a better understanding of not just what objectification is, but also like its psychological roots, how it impacts our mental health, how it impacts relationships, and ultimately what we can do about it.
It's a topic that we really need to dive deep into because it often stays at the surface level.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm curious, have you ever felt like you were reduced to just your appearance? Like your worth was tied to how you look? That's something that unfortunately happens a lot. This article defines sexual objectification as reducing a person to just their physical attributes and valuing them mostly for someone else's pleasure.
It's like you were saying, stripping away their humanity and their individuality and seeing them as a means to an end.
Yeah. And one example the article brings up that I thought was particularly striking is the example of unwanted sexual advances. That obviously completely ignores boundaries and consent. And I think that really highlights the harmful behaviors that can stem from objectification. But where does this even come from? Like, what are the roots of this mindset?
Well, it's a few things. It's not just about individual psychology, although the article does point to certain personality traits like psychopathy and narcissism as contributing factors.
Right.
Research suggests that individuals with these traits, well, they often lack empathy. Yeah. And that can make it easier to objectify others because you're not really considering their feelings.
So a lack of empathy paves the way for objectification. But is it just like personality, or is there more to it?
It's not quite that simple. Societal influences play a massive role, too. Think about all the messages we get through advertising, media, even just in our everyday conversations. They often reinforce harmful gender stereotypes.
That's true. I mean, think about how often we see women portrayed as objects of desire in the media. Like their value is tied to their appearance. It's almost like we're being conditioned to see the world through this objectifying lens.
Exactly. And the article really emphasizes this point. Take, for example, the over-sexualization of women in advertising. They're often presented as these passive figures, whose worth is based on their attractiveness to men.
Right.
And when we're exposed to these portrayals from a young age, it subtly shapes our perceptions.
Yeah, it's concerning when you think about the long-term effects of that constant exposure.
And the article gets into that too, the long-term effects. It highlights how objectification is linked to a whole bunch of negative mental health outcomes. Things like low self-esteem, distorted body image, and increased anxiety.
It makes sense though, right? If you're constantly being judged and valued solely based on your appearance, it's bound to make you feel inadequate and insecure.
Yeah. And it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more we're exposed to these messages, the more likely we are to internalize them.
Right.
And that's what the article refers to as internalized objectification. It's when you start viewing yourself through that same objectifying lens. So you end up judging yourself based on these external standards, and it can really lead to a loss of agency and power.
It's a vicious cycle. External pressures leading to internal struggles. But objectification doesn't just impact individuals, right? It impacts relationships, too.
Oh, absolutely. One of the biggest ways is that it just gets in the way of real intimacy. When you see someone as an object, as a means to an end, how can you build a genuine connection with them? One that's based on mutual respect and understanding.
Have you ever felt like you weren't truly seen or heard in a relationship, like your boundaries were crossed, or maybe just like communication totally broke down? Objectification, even if it's unintentional, can be a factor in those situations.
Yeah. It might be subtle, but what the article is arguing is that objectification creates this imbalance of power, which makes authentic connection basically impossible. One person's needs are always prioritized over the others. It's an inherently unhealthy dynamic.
And I feel like it also feeds into larger problems in society, like toxic masculinity and sexism.
Yeah.
Perpetuating that culture that often devalues consent.
Exactly. Think about the pressure men face to be dominant and to view women as conquests. And on the flip side, women are often expected to be passive and submissive. These gender roles that are so deeply ingrained in our culture, they not only perpetuate these stereotypes, but they also create an environment where consent is often ignored.
It's like we're trapped in a system where objectification is both a cause and a consequence of these bigger societal issues. So is there any hope? Like, does the article offer any solutions, or are we just stuck?
It does. There are some paths forward. And that's what we'll talk about next time. We'll explore some potential solutions and discuss how we can all work towards creating a world where respect and equality are the norm. So how do we even begin to break free from this cycle of objectification? Well, the article suggests that it all starts with a change in perspective.
Like changing how we see and treat each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And education's like a huge part of that.
Mm-hmm.
We need to start challenging those ingrained gender roles and those patriarchal norms from a young age.
Right.
Imagine if kids were taught to value empathy, respect, and consent right from the start.
Yeah, that would be huge. But how do we actually get there?
It's going to take some tough conversations, having those conversations early and often.
Right.
We need to talk to kids about healthy relationships and respecting boundaries.
Yeah.
And help them see each other as whole people, not just bodies.
I think media literacy is super important here, too. Like being able to critically analyze the messages we're constantly bombarded with, especially in advertising and entertainment.
Yeah. We need to recognize and challenge those portrayals that reduce people to just objects.
Yeah.
Like, think about all those hypersexualized music videos or those ads that use women's bodies to sell products. We need to start asking ourselves, what message is this sending? And how is this shaping our perceptions of ourselves and others?
It's about being more than just passive consumers. We need to be conscious of what we're taking in.
Exactly. And on a more personal level, what can you do as an individual to challenge objectification in your own life? The article offers some concrete actions here.
Okay, I'm listening. What can I do?
Well, it starts with taking a good hard look at yourself.
Okay.
Some self-reflection. Ask yourself, am I contributing to a culture of objectification, even in subtle ways?
That's a tough question.
It is, but it's necessary. And that it's about setting boundaries, both for yourself and in your relationships. You got to communicate your needs and expectations clearly. And don't be afraid to speak up if someone crosses a line.
And being mindful of other people's boundaries, too.
Yep.
Like recognizing that everyone deserves to feel safe and respected no matter how they look or express themselves.
Exactly. We need to create a culture of mutual respect where everyone feels seen and valued as a whole person.
We touched on the connection between objectification and a lack of empathy earlier, but the article dives a bit deeper into that, doesn't it?
It does. It's a really important point. Because when we lack empathy, it becomes so much easier to distance ourselves from other people's humanity.
Right.
We stop seeing them as complex individuals with their own thoughts and feelings and experiences. They become objects, almost like characters in a video game.
And that's when the objectification can really take root.
Exactly. Because without empathy, we're less likely to even recognize the harm we're causing. We don't grasp the pain that objectification inflicts.
It's like we're missing that crucial piece that allows us to truly connect with others on a deeper level.
Right.
And without that connection, it becomes way too easy to justify treating people in ways that we would never want to be treated ourselves.
And that leads to an important question. How do we actually cultivate more empathy in ourselves and in society as a whole?
That's a big one. Where do we even start?
Well, think about what we were just discussing about education. It has a huge role here, too.
Okay.
We need to be teaching kids about emotional intelligence and perspective taking. And most importantly, how to treat others with kindness and respect.
So it's not just about telling them what not to do. It's about giving them the tools to understand and connect with others.
Exactly. And exposing them to diverse perspectives is key. The more we interact with people from different backgrounds, the more we develop that capacity to empathize with experiences that are different from our own.
It's funny. We often think of media as part of the problem when it comes to objectification.
Yep.
But maybe it can also be part of the solution.
I think you're right. When we engage with stories that portray characters with depth and complexity, stories that explore the nuances of human relationships, it can help us develop our own empathy.
Like think about a movie that really moved you, or a book that changed your perspective, or even a song that helped you understand someone else's pain.
Yeah, those are all examples of how media can foster empathy.
We need to veer away from those simplistic two-dimensional portrayals of people and embrace stories that challenge stereotypes and celebrate the richness of human experience.
Right.
And even social media, for all its flaws, can play a role here too.
I think so.
When we use it intentionally, it can connect us with people and stories that we might not otherwise encounter.
Yeah, it's about being mindful of how we're using these platforms and being intentional about seeking out content that promotes empathy and understanding.
So cultivating empathy is an ongoing process.
It is.
It takes individual effort, societal shifts, and even leveraging the power of media and technology.
Exactly. It's a complex challenge, but it's essential if we want to create a world where objectification is no longer the norm.
And while the article mainly focuses on the sexual objectification of women, it's important to remember that anyone can be objectified.
You're absolutely right.
Right.
While women are disproportionately targeted by objectification, we can't forget that men can be objectified too.
Mm.
And it often happens in ways that reinforce those harmful masculine stereotypes.
Right.
Like, think about the pressure men face to be physically strong and stoic and unemotional.
Yeah.
Those are forms of objectification too, just expressed differently.
Then what about the objectification that happens based on someone's race or ethnicity or cultural background?
Exactly. When people are reduced to stereotypes or treated as exotic objects, it dehumanizes them and perpetuates harmful prejudice. It's about recognizing that objectification can take many forms and that it's harmful no matter who the target is. We need to challenge all forms of objectification and create a culture that values everyone's inherent worth and dignity.
So what does this all mean for our listeners? How can they take these insights about empathy and apply them to their own lives and relationships?
Well, it starts with cultivating a mindset of curiosity and openness. You know, approaching others with a genuine desire to understand their experiences and perspectives, even if they're different from your own.
It's about listening more than you speak, asking questions, and trying to see the world through their eyes.
Yeah, and being willing to challenge your own assumptions and biases.
Right.
We all have blind spots, so it's important to be open to feedback and to be willing to change our minds when we're wrong.
It's about being humble and recognizing that we don't have all the answers and approaching relationships with a desire to learn and grow.
And when you encounter objectification, whether it's directed at you or someone else, have the courage to speak up. Challenge those harmful attitudes and behaviors, even if it feels uncomfortable.
Use your voice to advocate for respect and equality for yourself and for others. And remember, even small actions can make a difference.
Absolutely. Every time we choose to engage with others in a more empathetic and respectful way, we're helping to create a culture that values human connection over superficiality and exploitation.
We've covered a lot of ground today, exploring the complex issue of objectification, from its definition and roots to its impact on mental health and relationships. But there's one more crucial aspect we need to address before we wrap up this deep dive, and that's consent.
That's a good point. Because at its core, objectification is a violation of consent.
Right.
It's about treating someone as an object for your own gratification without any regard for their feelings or boundaries.
So you could say that objectification kind of sets the stage for a lack of respect for consent.
Exactly. Consent is about respecting someone's agency and free will. It's about recognizing that everyone has the right to decide what happens to their own body,
Right.
and that no one has the right to violate that boundary.
And when objectification takes hold, consent is often ignored or minimized.
Yeah.
It becomes all about what the objectifier wants, not about what the other person is comfortable with.
And that's where we see the link between objectification and things like sexual harassment and assault and abuse.
Right.
When consent isn't valued, it creates a breeding ground for these harmful behaviors.
So how do we ensure that consent is at the forefront of our interactions, especially in a world where objectification is so common?
Well, education is key. We need to teach young people about the importance of consent, what it means, how to communicate it, and how to recognize when it's being violated.
And this education needs to start early, right? Like, we need to be having these conversations with kids from a young age.
Absolutely. And it's not just about kids. Adults need to be educated about consent too.
Yeah.
We need to unlearn those harmful attitudes and behaviors that we've picked up from societal norms and media messages.
We need to make conversations about consent normal.
Yes,
Make it clear that it's not awkward or taboo to talk about.
exactly. We need to be having open and honest conversations about sex and relationships where consent is a central part of the discussion.
And we need to challenge those power imbalances that can make it hard for some people to assert their boundaries or to say no.
You're right. We need to create spaces where everyone feels safe and empowered to speak up and where their voices are heard and respected.
So fostering a culture of consent is an ongoing process. It requires education, open communication, and a commitment to dismantling those power structures that silence and marginalize certain voices.
Exactly. It's a collective effort.
Yeah.
It takes individuals, families, communities, and institutions all working together to create a world where everyone feels safe, respected, and empowered to make their own choices.
Well said. And I think that's a perfect segue to our final thoughts on this deep dive into the objectification of others. Today, we really got into the nitty-gritty of sexual objectification, didn't we?
Yeah, we talked about a lot, like how insidious it can be,
Mm,
and how deep those psychological roots go.
right.
And the ripple effects, the consequences it has on people, on relationships, on society as a whole.
But I think the important thing is we're walking away from this deep dive, not just understanding the problem, but also having some ideas about how to be part of the solution.
Definitely. And our author really stresses that change is possible.
Mm-hmm.
It just starts with recognizing how deeply ingrained these patterns of objectification are,
Right.
like within ourselves, in our relationships, and in the media
Mm.
we consume every day.
I think it's helpful to think about a time when you might have seen objectification happen, even if it was subtle. Like maybe it was a joke that made you uncomfortable or, a media portrayal that reduced someone to just their appearance.
It's in those moments of awareness that we have a choice,
Right.
Do we stay silent or do we speak up?
Uh-huh.
We're going to perpetuate these harmful patterns, or are we going to challenge them?
I think that can feel really daunting sometimes. It's
Yeah,
like swimming upstream.
it is.
But even those little acts of resistance, like choosing empathy over apathy, they can make a difference.
For sure.
Imagine a world where we consistently challenge those sexist jokes and push back against media that perpetuates harmful stereotypes and call out objectification when we see it, even if it's happening in our own circles.
That's the goal, right?
It's about creating a culture where people are valued for all the things that make them unique and wonderful. You know,
Yeah.
their character, their intelligence, their humor, their kindness, for who they are as individuals, not just for how they look.
Exactly.
And we talked about education, but the real learning comes when we take these ideas and apply them to our own lives.
Right.
So here's a final thought for you to consider. What are some subtle ways that objectification might be present in your life? How can you contribute to a culture of respect and equality, a culture where everyone is valued for their full humanity?
It's not about pointing fingers or placing blame. It's about looking inward and growing and working together to create a world where everyone feels seen and heard and respected.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the objectification of others. We hope it gave you some things to think about and that you'll continue exploring these important conversations long after the episode is over.